For most dogs, the predominant and natural response to discomfort is not one that lends itself to good obedience. Some of these are reflexive and non-social and take the form of moving away from the source of unpleasant stimuli. We call this avoidance behavior. Other defensive responses are social and take the form of appeasement or submission or even aggression. It is true that some dogs are highly stimulated or excited by compulsion, but this tendency can be equally disadvantageous. If such an animal is corrected for being unmanageable, often the effect of the correction is to make him become even more out of hand.
Corrections are introduced once you know that the dog has done enough repetitions of the exercise to understand it, and you've also started to withhold food to a certain degree, because in order to understand the exercise, the dog has to understand that there is a certain thing that he's doing that gets the reward. So to introduce a correction before that concept was actually in place would be really unfair to the dog, because it wouldn't really know that there was a certain behavior that was getting the reward, and so that's the correct behavior. And then if he chooses to show the incorrect behavior, then at that point the dog is shown that the incorrect behavior, there's a consequence to it. And so the correction allows the dog then to make the choice whether they want to perform the incorrect behavior and be corrected, or the correct behavior and be rewarded. So there certainly has to be a firm understanding of what the correct behavior is before you would ever give a correction.
A well-trained animal responds to compulsion calmly, but also energetically. He understands that all he need do to avoid compulsion is to know what behavior brought it on and what behavior will circumvent it. He also responds actively, in the sense that he is confident that with a little more effort and a little experimentation, he can find the solution to the puzzle and avoid further compulsion. Finally, he responds to compulsion not by shutting down, but by energizing himself and becoming more active. Together, all of these tendencies can be referred to as proactive responses to compulsion.
It's really important to teach a dog to respond correctly to a correction, because it doesn't really matter what the temperament of the dog is. People in general think it's more of a problem with a soft dog that doesn't respond well to a correction. And that is true, but oftentimes a very strong dog doesn't respond well to correction either, if he hasn't been shown an appropriate way to respond to the correction, because the strong dog will have his whole set of other problems, whereas the weak dog melts. The strong dog may get aggressive or just tune you out and say, well, I really don't, there's nothing that you can do that will impress me, so go ahead and correct me because I don't really care. And so in order that both types of dogs will show a correct response to a correction, you need to introduce the correction and then immediately show them a way to respond to the correction that is appropriate and brings them back into drive.
Joanne employs a specific exercise to teach him to respond proactively to compulsion. However, she does not introduce this compulsion exercise until the dog is really healing, that is, paying attention and driving for reward rather than just at reward. The dog wears a long link chain choke collar and a light, short leash. The leash should be attached to the dead ring on the collar. Handle the leash in your right hand, reserving the left for feeding and praising the dog. The first corrections are delivered at the halt. Now, let us be clear. First, the correction itself is not linked to any error or misbehavior on the dog's part. It is wholly unrelated to his behavior. Second, it is not really a correction. It is a very faint approximation of a real collar correction. All we do in the beginning is deliver a gentle jerk on the collar, only enough for the dog to see your hand move, hear the collar jingle, and feel a light snap at his neck. Then, in the very next instant, you release the dog into you and reward him. This release, like the correction, is not related to the dog's behavior. How you reward the dog depends upon his temperament. However, in order to get the rush of energy we need just after the correction, most dogs will need to be given their toy. What Joanne intends here is to establish a learned connection at the level of reflexes and emotions between the stimuli surrounding a collar correction and physiological arousal. This is what is called Pavlovian or classical conditioning. At this point, the correction is in no way unpleasant. Through conditioning, it develops the ability to trigger an activated and fulfilling drive state related to food, petting, and play. This activated response becomes the animal's predominant reaction to the stimuli surrounding a collar correction, even when the correction gains force. Later on, when we use a sharp jerk on the collar to punish a momentary lapse of attention, we will find that even though the correction itself is unpleasant and serves to discourage inattention, in the next instant, the dog anticipates a strong reward. As a result, he comes into drive and becomes very active. Because of this activity, he automatically displays good, energized heeling immediately after the correction and earns a reward. After a number of repetitions of this exercise using a very, very light correction, Joanne begins to gradually ramp up the amount of force she exerts, all the time teaching the dog that this pop on the collar is the signal for play and feeding. At the same time, you can begin administering these pseudo-corrections while in motion, and even use them customarily to end periods of healing. Where to stop in this process of increasing the severity of the correction is a complicated question. The intent is not to increase the force until we are actually inflicting pain. It is best to stay under the threshold of pain. In fact, it is easy to do so. Because the dog interprets the jerk on the collar as the signal for play rather than as punishment, you will find that his perception of how painful it is becomes completely altered. He will happily anticipate and look forward to a pop on the leash that, in another circumstance, he might regard as quite disagreeable. Once you see that the animal interprets a relatively stout jerk on the leash as merely an enticement to play, once he comes reflexively into drive, then you are ready to use an actual correction. Such a correction is not used to teach him to heel closer or sit faster or execute any skill more correctly. These things should be taught inducively, and if they have not been well taught, then compulsion is not the answer. With inducive techniques, we can establish strong attention that is surprisingly reliable. However, in Joanne's opinion, under the stress and strain of competition, sooner or later the dog's attention will lapse, most especially when he finds himself in novel or exciting circumstances. Thus, the proper role for compulsion is to make the dog immune to distraction. Sit the dog at your side, tell him heel, and have him pay attention for a moment. Then, give him an arbitrary mock correction, and release him, and play with him. Then sit the dog at the halt again, and introduce a low-level distraction, a person walking by, or a door opening near him. At the moment that the dog looks away from you, correct him very sharply with the collar, substantially harder than you have ever done before, and then release him into you and play with him. After you repeat this exercise several times, one of two things will happen when you introduce the distraction. In the first case, you may find that he does not allow himself to be distracted. He instead remains focused on you, and in fact, the strength of his driving will increase slightly. After a few moments, reward this effort. In the second case, you may find that he does indeed look away so that you must correct him again. However, after the correction, he will resume attention, and this attention will be extremely activated and intense because of the conditioned energizing effect of the correction. After several seconds, you can reward him for his renewed attention. After administering a correction, do not let the dog have the toy until he pushes you and shows drive. With time and repetition, you can gradually help him less and less, so that your dog learns to come strongly into drive after a correction on his own. At this point, you will be ready to institute corrections while actually healing.